All right, so today we're diving into some pretty cool stuff in AI, how to really amp up those large language models we've been hearing so much about. And we're zeroing in on two specific techniques: Retrieval-Augmented Generation, which everyone calls RAG, and then there's Cache-Augmented Generation, or CAG.
Yeah, we've been digging through a bunch of articles on RAG and CAG for this deep dive. And I think, the main goal here is to give everyone listening a crystal clear picture of how these techniques actually work.
Exactly, no jargon overload.
Right, we're going to break it down, see how they're different, and more importantly, when you might want to use one versus the other. Because, they both have their strengths and weaknesses, right?
Absolutely. So let's kick things off with RAG, Retrieval-Augmented Generation. Can you give us, the elevator pitch? What's ARG all about?
Imagine giving an already smart AI the ability to hit the books whenever it needs to, even look up stuff it didn't know before. That's kind of the magic of our gag.
So it's not limited to just what it learned during its initial training.
Nope, it can tap into all sorts of external sources. And the cool thing is, it does this in real time as it's generating text.
Very cool. So break it down for us. What are the nuts and bolts of how RAG actually does its thing?
Okay, so the first key step is indexing. Basically, you take all the information you want the AI to have access to. This could be anything: documents, databases, web pages, you name it. And you convert it into a format that the AI can understand.
And how do you do that?
You create what are called embeddings. They're like numerical representations, sort of like digital fingerprints, that capture the meaning of the information.
So each piece of information gets its own unique fingerprint.
Exactly. And these fingerprints are then stored in these special databases called vector databases, which are designed for lightning-fast similarity searches.
Ah, so when a question comes in, that's where the retrieval part kicks in, right?
Right. So let's say you ask the AI a question. The first thing it does is convert your question into its own embedding. Then it uses a retriever, which is like a super efficient search engine, to scan the vector database and find the document embeddings that are most similar to your question's embedding.
So the more similar the fingerprints, the more relevant the information,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah, got it.
Okay, so we've retrieved the relevant info. What happens next?
So the next stage is called augmentation. Here's where the retrieved information is actually integrated into your original question. This is often done through prompt engineering, which is kind of like crafting a more informative and context-rich prompt for the LLM.
So the LLM is not just getting my basic question, it's getting all this additional relevant information.
Exactly. And this enriched prompt is what fuels the final stage generation. The LLM now has everything it needs, your initial query, plus all this relevant context to generate a really insightful and informative response.
That makes a lot of sense. So what are the big wins of using RAG? Why go this route?
One of the biggest advantages is dynamic knowledge access. What I mean by that is RBAG can pull information from all sorts of sources in real time. So it's always up to date. This is huge, especially in fields where things are constantly changing.
So no more outdated information. The AI is always in the loop.
Exactly. And this leads to another major benefit: fewer hallucinations.
Hallucinations.
Yeah, that's when LLMs make things up, basically.
Yeah.
But because RA grounds its responses in solid, factual information that it just retrieved, the chances of it going off the rails are much lower.
Right. It's not just pulling things out of thin air.
Exactly. And to boost that trust even further, RAG often provides transparency and verifiability.
Meaning?
A lot of RAG systems can give you links back to the sources they used. So if you want to double-check the information or see where it came from, you absolutely can.
That's a big deal, right? It builds trust and accountability. What other advantages does RAG bring to the table?
Another key one is adaptability. When new information comes along, you don't have to retrain the whole LLM from scratch, which is a huge time-consuming process. With RAG, you simply update the knowledge base and the AI is good to go.
So it's much more agile. It can easily keep up with the latest developments. I also came across a couple of really cool analogies in the articles we read. One described RAG as an open book exam for LLMs, while another one called it a dynamic researcher always updating its knowledge.
Yeah, those are great analogies. They really capture the essence of what RAG is all about, don't they? And from an enterprise perspective, RAG is really exciting. It lets businesses connect their LLMs to their own internal data, like company documents, policies, and knowledge bases. This makes the AI much more relevant and trustworthy for their specific needs. One of the articles even mentioned how IBM is using Argy to power their internal HR chatbots so employees can get accurate and up-to-date answers to their policy questions.
That's a fantastic use case. You also mentioned earlier the importance of vector databases and semantic search for RG. Can you elaborate on how those play into effective information retrieval?
Absolutely. So those vector databases are like specialized libraries for those embeddings we talked about. Their whole structure is optimized for super fast searches in high-dimensional spaces, which is exactly what you need to quickly find the most relevant information. And semantic search is crucial because it goes beyond just matching keywords. It actually tries to understand the meaning of the query in the documents so we could retrieve information that's conceptually related, even if the words aren't an exact match.
So it's not just about finding the needle in the haystack, it's about understanding the whole haystack.
Yeah, that's a great way to put it.
Okay, so RG is all about dynamic knowledge and retrieval. Now let's shift gears and talk about CAG, Cache-Augmented Generation. This seems to be a different beast altogether, right?
It is. CAG is really all about speed and efficiency. It leverages the fact that modern LLMs have these increasingly large context windows.
Context windows. Remind us what those are again.
Sure, it's basically the amount of text the LLM can process at once. And the cool thing is, these modern LLMs can handle a ton of text now.
So how does CAG make use of that?
Well, instead of retrieving information on the fly like RAG, CAG does something called context preloading. It basically loads a whole bunch of potentially relevant documents directly into the LLM's context window up front.
So it's like stuffing the LLM's brain with all this information before it even gets asked a question.
Yeah, kinda. And this is where the caching part comes in.
Okay, so it's preloaded, now what?
So you're right, it could get very memory intensive, but to avoid that, it does what's called parameter caching. Specifically, it uses something called key value caches or KV caches.
Yeah.
It's a bit technical, but basically think of it like the LLM pre-computing and storing shortcuts based on the information it's already loaded. This way, it doesn't have to redo all the heavy lifting every time it gets a question.
So it's kind of like doing all the hard work ahead of time?
Exactly. And this leads to the final stage, which is direct inference. When you ask a question, the LLM can just use the preloaded information and those cache shortcuts to generate a response super quickly without needing to go out and retrieve anything.
Got it. So speed is a big plus for CAG. What else makes it stand out?
Well, yeah, like you said, eliminated retrieval latency is a huge one. Because there's no need to fetch information at runtime, CAG is lightning fast compared to RAG. Some studies have even shown speedups of like 40 times or more.
Wow, that's seriously impressive.
It is. And another advantage is that it often simplifies the system architecture. You don't need that extra retrieval component, so the whole system is less complex and easier to manage.
Fewer moving parts, fewer headaches.
Right. CAG can also improve reliability in certain cases. By removing the retrieval step, you eliminate potential errors that can happen during that process, so you tend to get more consistent and predictable responses.
So it's more robust in a way.
Yeah. And finally, CAG allows for something called holistic context processing. Because the LLM has access to the entire preloaded knowledge base, it can consider all the information as a whole rather than just bits and pieces. This often leads to more coherent and well-rounded answers.
Interesting. It's like giving the LLM the full picture instead of just snippets.
Exactly. And, a couple of the articles we looked at had some really cool analogies for CAG. One likened it to having a meticulously prepared toolbox where everything is ready to go. Another one described it as a meticulous craftsman focused on precision and consistency.
Those really paint a vivid picture, don't they? So when does CAG really shine? What kind of applications is it best suited for?
CAG is a great choice when you're working with knowledge that's fairly stable and well-defined. Think technical documentation, educational content, reference guides, things like that, things that don't change too frequently.
Right, makes sense. So when the information is relatively static.
Exactly. You also mentioned earlier that there are two different perspectives on CAG, model intrinsic and application layer caching. Could you quickly explain the difference and why it matters?
Yeah, definitely.
So model intrinsic CAG, which is what we've mostly been talking about, really focuses on leveraging the LLM's own internal caching mechanisms to optimize the processing of the preloaded information. It's like making the LLM itself smarter and more efficient. Application layer caching, on the other hand, is about building an external cache at the application level, almost like a shortcut library for frequently accessed information, or even for things that were previously retrieved by our ARG system. So it's about optimizing the information flow outside of the LLM. Both approaches aim to improve speed and efficiency, but they do it in different ways.
Okay, so it's about where the optimizations happen within the LLM or at the application level. So we've got a good grasp of both REG and CAG now. But the million-dollar question is, how do you actually choose between them? What are the key decision points?
Yeah, that's the crucial part, right? Let's break it down. First off, response time. Here, CAG is the clear winner. It's just so much faster because it doesn't have to retrieve anything.
So if speed is your top priority, CAG is probably the way to go. What about resource utilization? Does one use more memory than the other?
That's a little more nuanced. If you have a really massive and constantly growing knowledge base, RX might be more memory efficient in the short term because it only loads what it needs.
Hmm.
CAG, on the other hand, needs to preload everything, which can be memory intensive. But if you're dealing with a smaller, stable knowledge base and you're going to be asking a lot of repetitive questions, CAG's caching can actually make it more efficient over time.
So it depends on the size and stability of the knowledge base and how you're going to be using it. What about scalability? How well do they handle really large amounts of information?
RAG tends to scale better with massive and ever-growing knowledge bases. It's more adaptable to handling huge amounts of data that just wouldn't be practical to preload for CAG.
So if you're dealing with a constantly expanding universe of information, RG is the more scalable choice. How about information currency? Which one is better at keeping the information up to date?
RA is definitely the champion here. It can pull the latest information in real time, which is essential if you're dealing with rapidly changing data. CAG's knowledge is static once it's preloaded and cached, so it's not as good for situations where staying current is absolutely crucial.
So RJ is the go-to for anything that requires up-to-the-minute accuracy. What about the breadth of knowledge they can access?
RG has the potential to access a much wider range of information. It's really only limited by the size and scope of the knowledge bases it's connected to. CAG, on the other hand, is limited to what's been preloaded, so its knowledge base is inherently more constrained.
So if you need access to a vast and diverse pool of information, RG is the more versatile choice. Now, what about the quality of the output? How do they compare in terms of accuracy versus coherence?
It's interesting. RA tends to prioritize accuracy because its responses are directly tied to the factual information it retrieves. CAG, because it's working with this holistic view of the preloaded context, often leans towards generating more coherent and consistent outputs, like it's telling a more complete story.
So RA is more about sticking to the facts, while CAG is more about crafting a smooth and cohesive narrative. But they both have their potential downsides, right? Where might things go wrong?
Absolutely. With RA, the main risk is retrieval errors. If the retriever picks the wrong documents, the response could be inaccurate or misleading. CAG avoids those retrieval errors, but the downside is that it can provide outdated information if the preloaded content isn't refreshed regularly.
So different types of risks to be aware of. And finally, how easy is it to adapt to changes in the information?
RA is generally more adaptable. If the underlying information changes, you just update the knowledge base and you're good to go. With CAG, you need to refresh the preloaded context and potentially recalculate those cached parameters, which can be a more involved process.
So RG is a bit more agile when it comes to handling changes. All right, that's a really helpful breakdown of the key differences. So let's get practical. When should you choose RG for an application?
RG is a good choice when you're dealing with rapidly changing information, like news updates, market data, or scientific research. It's also the way to go if you need to tap into a really broad and diverse knowledge domain that wouldn't fit into an LLM's context window. If accuracy and verifiability are critical, RG's transparency features are a big plus. And for enterprise knowledge management, where you need to keep the AI up to date with all your internal documents and information, RG is often the most effective approach.
So dynamic information, large knowledge domains, fact-checking, and enterprise knowledge, those are all areas where ARC excels. What about CAG? When is it the better choice?
CAG is a great option when you have a more stable and well-defined knowledge base, like technical documentation, educational materials, or reference guides. It's also ideal for applications where speed is paramount, like customer service bots or virtual assistants. If you need consistent and coherent outputs, like for marketing copy or product manuals, CAG is a good fit. And if your knowledge base is relatively small and manageable, CAG can be a really streamlined and efficient solution.
So stable information, a need for speed, consistent outputs, and a manageable knowledge base, those are CAG's sweet spots. And we also briefly touched on the possibility of combining the best of both worlds with hybrid approaches.
Yeah, that's a really interesting area. You could use CAG for your core, stable knowledge, and then use RShag to handle more specific or dynamic queries. Or you could use CAG for quick, first-line responses and then escalate to RJ for more complex or nuanced questions. There are lots of possibilities, and it really comes down to understanding your specific needs and the nature of the information you're working with.
Hmm.
One of the articles we read talked about a system that used CAG for initial retrieval and then used RJ for double-checking the results.
That's really clever, combining their strengths to get the best possible outcome. So, to sum it all up,
RJ is your go-to for dynamic, vast knowledge, where staying current is key. It's a bit slower, but it's really good at getting the facts right.
and CAG is all about speed and consistency. It works best with stable, well-defined knowledge that fits comfortably within the LLM's grasp.
Exactly. And as LLMs continue to evolve and their context windows get even larger, it's going to be really interesting to see how this balance between retrieval and preloading plays out. Who knows what kind of amazing hybrid approaches we might see in the future.
Yeah, it's definitely a rapidly evolving area and one that's worth paying close attention to. Thanks for taking this deep dive with us today. It's been a really enlightening conversation.
My pleasure. Until next time.
See you next time.